In the previous chapter, we've looked at the idea that the main objective of financial strategy is to maximize shareholder wealth. However, in the real world, this won't be straightforward, and there'll be a number of factors that you'll come across that make it very difficult for you to deliver a good return to your shareholders. These factors are called constraints. This is a key term. When this chapter has been tested in the past, many candidates have not recognized the term constraints. In this chapter, we're going to define constraints and look briefly at how they can be managed. Okay, let's start with internal constraints. The most common internal constraint is that managers, through their deliberate actions, benefit themselves rather than their shareholders, and this is what lecture example 1 is themed on. There are many examples of this in practice. For the Royal Bank of Scotland, Sir Fred Goodwin was paid £2.7 million in 2007 for successfully achieving the takeover of ABN AMRO. This was a major acquisition by the Royal Bank of Scotland, and many observers felt that they paid far too high a price. But one of the reasons that Sir Fred Goodwin would have been very keen for this takeover to happen was the structure of the incentive scheme. In addition, he was being paid over £4 million, which many observers felt was a touch on the generous side, even for the chief executive of a major bank. So I'd like you to take some time now to think through lecture example 1. There are many points that you could come up with here, but to tie back into the previous chapter, I'd like you to try and group your thinking under 3 headings. What investment decisions, financing decisions, and dividend decisions might a director take that's in their own self-interest but doesn't necessarily benefit their shareholders? So using this structure, we can see that managers might fail to invest because by doing that, they might be able to manipulate short-term profits, make them look slightly better, and that in turn might help them to earn bonuses. By avoiding debt finance, managers reduce the requirement to manage cash flows tightly, to manage working capital responsibly. Avoiding debt is sometimes in the shareholders' best interests, but the point here is that managers will generally try to avoid the use of debt finance, and sometimes that might be bad for shareholders. And finally, dividends are sometimes seen as an expense to the business rather than a reward to shareholders. Now read to the end of section 1. Okay, so how to deal with this problem? Well, first of all, you're going to be asked to comment on corporate governance systems, but in no detail, because the detail is examinable in another of your strategy papers. In the UK, it's crucial to have good, independent, non-executive directors to monitor the actions of the board. And if we look back to the experience of the Royal Bank of Scotland, one of the criticisms of their non-executive directors was that many of them had been in place for 8 years. The maximum recommended is 9. But by being in place for 8 years, it was felt that they knew the board too intimately, and they were perhaps unwilling to make the criticisms that were needed. Incentivizing directors with share options is difficult, particularly when the stock market is depressed. Directors may feel that they have to take extremely risky investment decisions for their share options to be worth anything. And so there's an increasing trend for directors to be given shares as a reward for good performance instead of share options. And these shares might be held on trust for 3 years, and they'll definitely be worth something at the end of the 3-year period. And so managers will feel that they're being given a serious reward that reflects their good performance, and will be interested in maintaining the share price so that these shares are worth as much as they can be, without taking very risky investment decisions. The second category of constraints are external constraints. And so looking out to your environment, you might see that commercial banks want to impose restrictive covenants on you as they lend you money, and these covenants might prevent you from borrowing further funds or from disposing of assets. Customers will always be looking for high quality levels and ideally low prices as well. Suppliers will want you to pay on time and to pay a premium price. The government might look to increase taxation, and any sort of tax increase is going to be bad news for business. And there are many other points you could make here as well. The point here is that each of these stakeholder groups have some power and influence over you. And so when you're forming your financial strategy, particularly your investment strategy, if you feel that these stakeholders are too powerful, you may look for environments with less stakeholder power. So, for example, Tesco over the past few years have started to see great results from their overseas investments, particularly their investments in Asia. And these have enabled them to move away from very choosy customers and very powerful rivals in the UK. So where your stakeholders are powerful, this is one potential response. Now can you briefly review the rest of the chapter, have a look at lecture example 3, and we'll debrief that in a minute. Because the government is potentially such a powerful stakeholder, lecture example 3 just explores some of the decisions that a government could take that could hurt a company and how these might be managed. We'll look at these sorts of areas later in the course, and there are a variety of points you could have thought of here. But basically, if corporation tax is going up in your local economy, you could perhaps consider locating overseas. If tighter regulations are being brought in or proposed, you could build that into your investment appraisal. If an overseas government is blocking your ability to pay dividends, then you could perhaps think about taking some of the profit back into your local country by using slightly higher transfer prices when you're charging your overseas subsidiary for parts and services. If an overseas government is going to cut the exchange rate, that's going to reduce the value of your assets. But if you've got debt finance in that currency, it would reduce the value of your liabilities as well. Note that hedging, as a method of managing exchange rate risk, is covered in paper P3. Price controls, where you could establish what's being proposed and then potentially negotiate with a regulator so that you understand the standards that they'll impose on you prior to making an investment. Okay, so from this chapter, which is a fairly straightforward chapter, you need to make sure that you recognise the term internal constraint and external constraint.